بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back everyone to our penultimate lecture, lecture 14, in discussing the Sulam al-Munawraqi in logic, Islamic logic. Today, inshallah, we are going to do lines 92 to 106, and I got to pick up some speed because as I was preparing for this lecture, I realized that I was going too slow. So inshallah, there'll be a lot of information in this class, but I will try to compensate the speed with enough examples that you can when you learn the examples and you go back to the text, you'll understand. So we left off talking about the figures of the correct correlative syllogism, al-iqtirani. So we are going to do figure 4. It will be very simple, like the one that we did, like the three that we did in the last lecture. We'll read the line of poetry and I'll give you guys some examples. And then actually the rest of the lines in the section on figures, which is line 93 to 99, is actually just a summary of everything that we just said. So that's one of the other reasons why it's not too much information. He's going to summarize the things that I mentioned to you in the beginning about what happens when you drop something, how the conclusions are determined, circular argument, things that they're all going to be summaries of things that we've talked about that, it made sense in teaching that it comes first, but they're going to come second. So that's not too much of a big deal. Then the next section is on the selective syllogism, al-qiyas al-istithna'i, and that's the second type of syllogism that we have. And this one is going to be a little bit different in that sometimes the way that the syllogism is formed it will sound a little bit odd. We're not used to talking like that. But basically there are two kinds. There's al-ittisal, a conjunctive, and there's al-infisal, the disjunctive. And in that we're going to give copious examples. There's a lot of twists and turns in some of the commentaries, but my way is just to kind of flood you with the examples, and then when you go back and you read it, you remember, oh, there are all of these examples. Hopefully that will be clear. That's the game plan. Let's see how far we get. We'll begin inshallah on the next clip. All right, so let's begin the way we always begin our classes, the text-based approach, which is to go back to the text itself. We're going to be doing lines 92 and 93 first. So قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين ورابع عدم جمع الخستين إلا بصورة ففيهما يستبين عفوا ورابع عدم الجمع الخستين إلا بصورة ففيها يستبين. The fourth figure stipulates the absence of having the two values of quantity and quality together except in one form or mood, in which case it is evident. So, in the fourth figure, which we said before when we introduced the concept of the figures, we said is the opposite of the first figure, there are two conditions. The first condition is that the minor premise be affirmative particular. Therefore, the major premise has to be negative universal. So, let me give you those conditions and we'll go back to the examples. The second condition for figure 4 is that they can't be united, the minor and the major premise, in their qualities. So if the minor premise is affirmative particular, then it's got to be it has to be the major premise will have to be the opposite of that, so that they are not united. So why don't we give you, and this will generate 5 scenarios. So let me give you the example and one by one. The first example is that the minor premise is affirmative universal and the major premise is affirmative universal. So therefore the conclusion is affirmative particular. So if you said every human being is an animal and every articulate being is a person, therefore some of the animals are articulate. The second example is if the minor premise is affirmative universal and the major premise is affirmative particular, then the conclusion is affirmative particular. So if you said every animal has feeling, and then you said some bodies are animals, therefore some of those who have some that have feeling are bodies. The third example is if you had the minor premise was negative universal, the major premise was affirmative universal, the conclusion would be negative universal. So if you said nothing from the human beings is an inanimate object, and then you said, and some that articulate are human, and everything that articulates is human, therefore the conclusion is nothing from the inanimate objects is articulate. In the fourth scenario, if the minor premise was affirmative universal and the major premise was negative universal, the conclusion would be negative particular. So if you said every animal moves by their own will, and then you said nothing from the inanimate objects are animals, therefore nothing that moves is an inanimate object. And the last example is if you had the minor premise to be affirmative particular and the major premise to be universal negative, the conclusion would be negative particular. So if you said some of the animals are humans and nothing from the inanimate objects are animals, therefore some humans are not inanimate objects. So these are the 5 examples of form figure 4, just following exactly what we did. And let me just keep going so we don't lose steam. Okay, lines 94 and 95. فمنتج لأول أربعة كالثاني ثم ثالث فستة. Thus the first figure yields 4 moods, like the second and the third 6 moods. I did all of that before. So we talked about figures 1, figures 1 and figures 2 give us 4 examples. Figure 3 gives us 6 examples. ورابع بخمسة قد أنتج وغير ما ذكرته لن ينتج. And the fourth figure, the one that we just did, gives us 5 moods, and what I did not mention does not yield anything. And that was my approach, is that even though in this commentary that I have and other ones that are longer, they'll go through all of the permutations, I'm not so concerned about that right now in this stage of you studying logic. I just want you to know that if it's not the 4, 4, 6, 5, those are the ones that concern us. Of the 4 figures, anything, any combination outside of those combinations is not a logical syllogism. That's all that you need to know. So it's just easier to learn what forms the actual syllogism. 96. وتتبع النتيجة الأخص من تلك المقدمات هكذا زكن. Furthermore, the conclusion follows the premises that which has the lowest value, that is particular or negative. This is how it is determined. So whatever has the lowest value is going to pull the conclusion towards it, because the lowest value is going to be the common thing between the larger and the lower. So if you have universal and particular, it's going to be particular. If you have affirmative and negative, it's going to be negative. That's what he's saying, and that's something that you saw from the examples. That's why I said in the introductory clip, these are just sort of conclusions that we kind of have talked about already. Okay, line 97. وهذه الأشكال بالحملي مختصة وليس بالشرطي. Moreover, these figures are specific to the categorical syllogism and not the selective. That is the opinion of Al-Abhari, the author of the Isarouj and the Sulam. But of course, there's an exception. So in the later schools of approaches of logic, the four forms also belong to the selective syllogism. So let me give you those four forms in the selective syllogism in very short form. So the first form, I lost my place on the page. So if you said, every time you have a human being, he is an animal, and every time you have an animal, he has feeling. Therefore, every time you have a human being, you have feeling. This would be the first form. The second form in the selective syllogism is if you said, every time you have a human being, he is articulate, and it is not possible at all for a horse to be articulate. Therefore, it is not possible for a human being to be a horse. The third form would be, every time you have a human being, he has feelings, and every time you have a human being, he is articulate. Therefore, it is possible that if something has feelings, he is articulate. And then the fourth form would be, every time you have a human being, you have an animal, he's an animal, and every time you have an articulate being, he's a person. Therefore, it is possible that if you have an animal, the animal is articulate. But the next section will be the details of the selective syllogism, but I just wanted to mention the four forms here, and I'll pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. All right, so the last clip, we just did the four forms of the selective syllogism, sharti, and we said that this is in opposition to the madhab of the author of the text. Okay, lines 98. والحذف في بعض المقدمات أو النتيجة لعلم آت. Dropping one of the premises or the conclusion happens due to knowledge of the item dropped. Now this is also very important because we drop so much of the premise, we forget that we are always speaking in syllogisms. So if somebody comes, for example, having used the bathroom, then they want to pray, I would say to them, you have to make wudu. You have to make wudu is a conclusion of two premises. If you use the bathroom, or if you relieve yourself, or something more technically, if something comes out of the private parts, you enter into a state of hadath. If you enter in a state of hadath and you want to pray, you have to make wudu. Therefore, you have to make wudu. But we don't talk like that. But we think like that. And there are many things that are, if you just pause, you will see that every time you make a statement in which there's a judgment, this is a section of the mantiq that we are in, the tasdiqat, the judgments, you are going through a syllogism in one of these forms, one of these moods, etc. But oftentimes things are dropped, as the author said, because there's a prior knowledge. Al-ahd, there's something prior in the mind that's an agreement in the people that are in the room, for example, that we're discussing, that allows us to drop some of the things that have been said. And that's very important to remember. So one of the usefulness, is that the right word? Usefulness, yeah. Let me restate that. One of the uses of the study of logic is to call back to our attention and to our conscious mind the fact that we really are thinking and speaking like this all the time. That's why, in a large way, Muslims accepted the study of logic because it's something that is natural. Just like grammar is natural, it's been established that the Arabic language or any language follows certain grammatical patterns, therefore, we'll codify it. So the Muslims understood what Aristotle did as simply codifying the way we think and the way that we talk, whether they are tasawwurat, whether they are conceptual items, or whether they are tasdiqat, or whether they are judgments. But because there is so much in the human conversation that is shared, we oftentimes drop things from the conclusion that we make. But if you pause, well, how did you come to that conclusion? Then you will recreate a syllogism. So that's important to remember. So I'm glad he added that line. And then the last line of this section, line 99, وتنتهي إلى ضرورة لما من دور أو تسلسل قد لزم. And the conclusion of the syllogism. The conclusion tends to be self-evident due to the impossibility of circularity or infinite regress. التسلسل, circularity, is that the conversation keeps going back in a circle, or that's a dawr. Sorry, a dawr is a circular argument, and التسلسل, infinite regress. It just keeps going back and back and back and forever. Those two are considered in the study of logic, in the language of logic, to be muhal. They're impossible, and they are batil. They are therefore not correct. So if you find yourself making an argument that is a circular argument or an infinite regress argument, the argument is wrong. And the reason the syllogism is that so far, when we've talked about the correlative al-iqtirani syllogism, the one that we've been talking about up until now, the definition is self-evident. بذاته. It is by the nature of the argument itself that the conclusion has to be. If you agree with premise 1 and premise 2, if you agree with the minor premise and the major premise, then the conclusion is a foregone conclusion. It has to be that. And if somebody does not agree with that, then they have not agreed with something that is of the basic logical skills. And that's why I keep repeating over and over again that much of our language in the modern world has become illogical, literally illogical, because we are not making sense according to the rules of logic. And that's also important because in the study of logic, we oftentimes will come up and brush up against debates and argumentation, as I've mentioned in the previous class. Okay, let me keep going, so I don't want to ramble forever. Okay, now we're going to talk about the selective syllogism, al-sharti. So he says in line 100, ومنه ما يدعى بالاستثناء يعرف بالشرطي بلا امتراء. And of the syllogism, there's a type called selective. It is known by the name selective syllogism without doubt. Now, he uses two words in the Arabic, istithna'i and sharti, and there has been a huge debate amongst those that write about Arabic and Islamic logic. What do you translate this as? And to make it simple for you, I just use the same word selective. So I'm not trying to establish the veracity of one translation over another. I'm just calling it selective. That's the same word that Dr. Salim uses in her work. So I'm just using it to be consistent with the work. So don't get all bent out of sorts when it comes to the translation. In Arabic, it's called istithna'i. So there's two types of qiyas in logic. Qiyas is a syllogism. One is iqtirani, categorical, and the other one is sharti, which is selective. Okay. And the reason it's called that is that it's made up of two conditions. If this is this, and if this is this, then therefore that. So those two premises in the beginning are conditioned. So for example, the example he has in my book, every time this in front of me is a person, you have an animal. Wait. Every time this in front of me is a person, then you also have an animal. However, he is a person, therefore he is an animal. That would be the basic type of selective syllogism. And in this, the major comes before the minor premise. كلما كان هذا إنسان. Every time this is a human being, then you have a animal. That's the major premise. However, this in front of me is a person. This is the minor premise. Therefore, the conclusion he is an animal. Line 101. وهو الذي دل على النتيجة أو ضدها بالفعل لا بالقوة. And this type of syllogism, and it points to the conclusion or its opposite, in actuality. In Latin they call it in actu, not in potentiality, in virtu. Meaning that its conclusion is implied in its premise, unlike the categorical syllogism. So, what this means is that the previous syllogisms that we've talked about, sorry, I should have translated it as correlative, not categorical. Sometimes it's easier just for me to correct while I'm teaching. Okay, so in the iqtirani, the one that we've done in the last two classes, in the correlative syllogism, we said that the conclusion is a necessary conclusion based on the inherent truth of the premise statements. This one, that's not the case. It is bilfa'al, it is exterior, it is an actuality based on the premises that you have just established. And that's the main difference between the two. Now, as we read, as I mentioned in the introductory clip, there are two types of the selective syllogism. There is the conjunctive and the disjunctive, the ittisal and the muttasil and the munfasil. And these are the things, the ones that he's going to give, the ones he's going to talk about in the next two lines. He will define them for us with a lot of examples. So in line 102 and 103. فإن يكن الشرطية ذا اتصال أنتج وضع ذاك وضع التالي. In the conjunctive syllogism, if the I see that I'm running out of time. Let me, rather than half speak it, let me just pick it up in the next clip, inshallah. My apologies. Okay, lines 102 and 103, introducing the conjunctive, the muttasil selective syllogism. فإن يكن الشرطية ذا اتصال أنتج وضع ذاك وضع التالي. This is the conjunctive one. If the selective syllogism is conjunctive, then the affirmation of the affirmation of the predicate then the affirmation of the predicate produces the affirmation in the premise. And then line 103, وَرَفْعُ تَالٍ رَفْعُ أَوَّلٍ وَلَا يَلْزَمُ فِي عَكْسِهِمَا لِمَنْ جَلَى. And the negation of the premise produces the negation of the predicate, but that does not follow necessarily in the case of their conversion due to it being evident with the logicians. Now, what does all of that mean? Well, بِالْمِثَالِ تَضَحِ الْمَقَالِ. So when we have the examples, this will be clear. So we have two ways of doing this type. The affirmation of the predicate will make the affirmation of the premise. And then the affirmation and the negation of the premise will negate the predicate. So the example that we're going to go with is that the first premise is every time this is a human being, and then the second premise is it is an animal. Every time there's a human being, every time we have a human being, we have an animal. Then the first example, however, this is a human being. The conclusion is, therefore, this is an animal. So it's affirmed. Every time we have a human being, we have an animal. However, now we're going to negate, however, this is not an animal. Therefore, this is not a human being. So that's what he is describing in lines 102 and 103. In the first example, we said in the concluding premise, we said, or in the conditional, we said, however, this is a human being. So we've confirmed it. The conclusion is, therefore, this is an animal. So in our istithna, in our selection in the first example, we selected that which was in the premise, which is every time you have a human being, you're saying, however, this is a human being, so you've confirmed it. So in that confirmation, the result is the confirmation. And in the second example, in our selection, in our istithna, we selected the opposite of the first premise, which is that every time this is a human being, you're saying, however, this is not an animal. We removed from the second premise, therefore, we have confirmed the opposite of the meaning of the syllogism. Okay. Lines 104, 105, and 106, the final lines for today. وَإِنْ يَكُنْ مُنْفَصِلًا. Now we're going to talk about the disjunctive, the munfasil. وَإِنْ يَكُنْ مُنْفَصِلًا فَوَضْعُ ذَا يُنْتِجُ رَفْعَ ذَاكَ وَالْعَكْسُ كَذَا. And if it is a disjunctive syllogism, a disjunctive selective syllogism, then the affirmation of the one produces the negation of the other, and their conversion also holds too. So they're opposites. 105. وذاك في الأخص ثم إن يكن مانع جمع فبوضع ذا زكن. This is so in the case of what is more specific, that is, the syllogism whose premises prevent both mutual inclusion and mutual exclusion. Therefore, should it be a case of a syllogism whose premise prevent mutual inclusion, then through affirming the one premise becomes known. I'm going to explain all of this inshallah. And then 106, رفعه لذاك دون عكس وإذا مانع رفع كان فهو عكس ذا. The negation of the other without the converse being the case, and if it is one whose premises prevent mutual negation, then it is the opposite thereof. Okay, in the disjunctive, the translation is not the best. I realize that, and the lines in Arabic are actually also difficult. So, in the disjunctive selective syllogism, we have three forms, three types. One is a true disjunction. The second type is prevents mutual exclusion. And the third type is prevents both premises to be false. So, an example of the first kind, a true disjunction. The example he gives is either a number is even or odd. So that's the sentence. So the first example, however, it is even, therefore it is not odd. The second example, however, it is odd, therefore it is not even. The third example, however, it is not even, therefore it is odd. In the fourth example, however, it is not odd, therefore it is even. So this is a true disjunction. Very clear. In the true disjunction, they're going to be opposites of each other. In the line 104, he said the affirmation of one produces the negation of the other and vice versa. In the second example, we are preventing them from being mutually exclusive. So the first premise is either this is white or it is black. So that's the sentence. The first example, however, it is white. The conclusion is therefore it is not black. The second example, however, it is black. And then the answer is, or the conclusion is therefore it is not white. So here, so they're not mutually exclusive. And then the third type, about both parts being false, for example, either this is black or it is other than white. So that's the sentence. The first example, however, it is black, therefore it is other than white. The second example, however, it is white, and therefore it is other than black. So these are the kinds of the disjunctive selective syllogisms. And then inshallah in tomorrow's class we'll conclude by some of the supplements, proofs, and then concluding remarks. Inshallah, hopefully that will be clear. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira. Alhamdulillah, in today's class we did lines 92 to 106 of the poem. We took the fourth figure of the correlative syllogism, just like we did in the last lecture. We went through all of the examples of them, and then the rest of the lines until line 99, which is the end of that section, were basically things that we've already taken in the beginning of the section of the syllogisms to talk about how the conclusion is a necessary conclusion, and how the conclusion will always take the lesser value if there are values in the two premises, how sometimes we drop some of the premises because it's already known. So sometimes when we speak, or oftentimes when we speak in a judgmental way, I don't mean that in the modern sense like I'm judging you, I mean like tasdiqat, in a logical way. We are actually speaking and thinking in syllogisms, but oftentimes we're not aware of it. And I gave you the example of the person that needs to make wudu. And then we talked about the non-logical nature of a circular or an infinite regress, ad-dawr and at-tasalsul. Next, we did the entire section of the selective syllogism, al-istithna'i, which is lines 100 to 106. And we learned that there were two kinds. There was the conjunctive, ittisal, and the disjunction, infisal. And that which makes the selective syllogism different than the correlative syllogism is that the selective syllogism is that its proof is in actuality, not by the actual nature of the premise. And the conjunctive syllogism, we gave you the examples. I gave you examples for both. And the lines of poetry and the translation, it's not the best translation, I admit, but the lines of poetry in the original Arabic are a little bit difficult. So again, this is one of those areas where the examples will be your best bet to make sense of them, inshallah. And those are the main topics that we talked about. And what's left is us to wrap up the supplements. the supplements to the syllogism, proofs, which al-hujjah, which is very important, and then we'll have some conclusions while we make our way to the end of the poem in the next class. I hope I can tuck that all in one, but we'll have to do our best. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.